and other memorabilia. And we were excited that Jim was interested in donating this collection to our Center for Holocaust Education. We do not have another archive like this, and it's quite extensive. And so we're grateful to Jim for donating it to us. And it's been a labor of love for this past year between the Seton Hill Archives, our archivist Bill Black, myself, a group of interns who have worked with us, arts administration students, students in the visual and performing arts program, and also in the humanities school. We've all worked together in an interdisciplinary way to put this collection together. So, so we're very pleased to have it and to have Jim with us today. So Jim, welcome to the program. And I guess my first question for you is, can you tell us a little bit about your experiences growing up? I know that you knew that your dad had this extensive collection of materials. Is it something that he talked to you about very much? How did you get to learn about this wonderful archive?
First, Jim, thanks for doing this. And I'm sorry we can't have the in-person presentation, but I really appreciate the online version and being able to make the collection available to people around the world. And I also truly appreciate how the manner in which you and the Center in Seton Hill have handled this and accepted it, and the gravity you've given to it. Really makes me feel, and my family, feel good knowing that the collection will be taken care of now in perpetuity. So, as far as growing up, my dad would only speak about these things primarily when prompted, usually by me. And my view into this world of his past was through the photo album. He had a couple of photo albums with these photographs in it. Now, if you turn them over, you'll see where someone removed them from the album, so you can see the stains in the back from the glue. But yeah, I spent my childhood looking through these once in a while growing up. So people look at the photographs now and they're horrified, and I understand, of course, but I'm not anymore. I grew up with these things. So, and when I got into photography myself as a teenager, he let me print his negatives. And you have some of those prints as well. So that's in part how I learned about photography, even using the cameras that he brought back from Germany back then.
And you still have that camera, I think.
I have one of them. I have a Nikon, what they call it, it's a Nikon made in, it's a Russian copy. I somehow wound up in Germany, he brought it back. I have, one of the cameras he used over there was a Rolleiflex. And this is a Sport, the small one. This is not it. This is very similar, though. I found this one on eBay, and I paid a retired Rolleiflex technician to rebuild it. So it's perfectly functional. But this is the kind of camera my dad brought on occasions, and this is one of the ones he used in Germany when he was there. So.
Well, that's fascinating. That's, you know, I think that, to me, the collection is quite unique, and it's historically significant as well, because your dad was in the 101st Infantry, or 102nd rather, 102nd Infantry Division, and it's one of the divisions that discovered the atrocities. They were arriving just at the end of the war, so they discovered the remains of the Nazi criminal activities. So that's one reason why it's significant, but also just the fact that your father took so many photographs and so extensively documented what he was seeing. It really tells the story of the average American soldier in many ways during World War II. And I know when we were talking the other day, I was mentioning that my father also is about the same age. He was in his late 20s when he was drafted, and he went into the Marines during the war. And your father was drafted as well. And sometimes we look back at that time and we're amazed at the sacrifices that people made. And so we should be. But at the same time, you also mentioned that your father, like my own, wasn't really eager to join necessarily. It just happened.
At all. He did not want to go, but he went.
Right. So he was in his late 20s and he served, it was about 4 years, I guess.
4 years, right.
Mhm. And by the end, he was, I guess, a supply officer. He'd gotten more responsibility. And you mentioned that he was good with machinery too. So he worked with.
He was initially a motor maintenance warrant officer junior grade, and then somehow moved over to supply in the quartermaster corps. I never heard much about that. I heard about the motors and the trucks and so forth. Yeah.
I see. Yeah. Well, one thing you definitely heard about was Father James Glynn, who became a close friend of your father. Father Glynn was a Vincentian priest who was a chaplain with 102nd. And so I'll share a couple of photos at this point. So first of all, here is Harry Knights, Jim's father. And you see that this is an official photograph. He's a handsome young guy. And then here he is with Father Glenn. And Jim, you told me how close they became, and I can really, I can understand why it would be important for a unit like this to have a chaplain there, somebody to give spiritual guidance. And even though your father wasn't an especially religious person, he and Father Glenn became
my dad,
very close.
Not only was he not religious, he was actually somewat disdainful of religion. But ironically, one of his best friends became a Catholic priest. Jim Glynn was from I think born in Manhattan and probably raised in the Bronx. So he had rough edges, a real gentleman. But he would swear, he would curse like hell and damn. And my mother, who was rather a prude, super Catholic, I call her, she didn't know what to do. She was appalled at this. It took her years to get used to a swearing priest.
Right.
Yeah.
It can be a bit of a shock. And I want to talk later too about the time after the war and their continued friendship and Father Glenn's involvement with your family. But I think that we should probably move on to talk about some of the key events. And as the war was winding down, the Nazis were determined not to have any of their prisoners survive. So regardless of the Geneva Convention or other principles for the treatment of prisoners, they were executing prisoners. And so they were taking prisoners from the outlying areas as the Allied forces closed in on them, from the outlying areas into the heart of Germany, where they would be killing them in the death camps in Germany. So in one particular case, they were transporting over 1,000 prisoners. And the railroad lines were blown up by the Allies. So they had to stop the train and come up with another plan. So they marched the prisoners into the small town of Gardelegen. And they first put them into an old school building, and then finally decided that, the Allies are approaching, we're going to need to deal with this problem. So they marched the prisoners into a very large barn, and they doused the bales of hay with gasoline, set the barn on fire, and locked the prisoners inside. Now, most of the prisoners were not Jewish. They were mainly ethnic Poles, and most were political prisoners. But in any case, they were still determined to get rid of them. So they set the barn on fire. Many of the of these soldiers perished inside. Others tried to escape, and if they would escape, the Nazi soldiers would machine gun them. So they killed, there were a few survivors, but they killed almost everyone, a little over 1,000 people. And it just happened that the 102nd Division arrived the very next day. So we do have to warn you, Jim mentioned before that there's a graphic nature to some of the photographs that his father took. And so I have to warn you about that because the bodies were still, they were not yet decomposed. And you could see that many people were struggling to get out of that inferno, the barn that was on fire. So I want to share just a couple of photos. There are many more in the collection, but just to give you a sense of what it's like. So there you see a soldier standing outside the barn where many of the bodies are still lying. And then there's also this photo that shows the bodies piled up in a heap. And before they had to hastily retreat from Gardelegen, the Nazis coerced local townspeople to help dig a trench where they began to bury bodies. And they had buried, I guess, about half of them by the time they had to scurry out of town. And so there was also a trench filled with bodies as well. And so you can imagine how the soldiers felt coming upon this scene, what a shock it would have been to them. And we are fortunate to have in the collection a letter that Father Glenn wrote at the time to a friend where he described his feelings upon encountering this horrific scene at Gardelegen. So I'm going to project the letter, and I asked Jim if he would read from the letter.
This is dated June 4th, 1945, so it's after the victory in Europe. And he's writing back to the seminary outside of Philadelphia to Father John Cody. And in one paragraph on the second page, he says, he speaks of the Elbe River, but he says, in our race to the Elbe, we came across a town named Gardelegen. Outside the town was a barn where 1,016 prisoners had been burned to death by the SS troopers. It was the most atrocious sight I have ever witnessed. The bodies were still smoldering and burning when we arrived. There were pictures of the scene in the May 7th Life magazine. We made the people of Gardelegen and the surrounding towns, and this is how he wrote it out, and gave them charge of each grave. Most of the murdered men were Poles and so Catholics. I said the funeral mass in the cemetery the day it was completed.
Right, so it's a powerful letter, and it's really significant that the U.S. Army forced townspeople to help to exhume the bodies and bury them properly in individual graves, each with a marker. And the townspeople were charged to be responsible for those graves in perpetuity and to confront the crime that the Nazis had committed, and by implication that they as well had been involved in. And I just want to quote briefly from a statement that Colonel George Lynch, the American colonel, made during the ceremony at which these bodies were committed to the earth. He said, "The German people have been told that stories of German atrocities were Allied propaganda. But here you can see for yourself. This is not the fault of Nazi leaders alone. It's the responsibility of the entire German people. Your so-called master race has demonstrated that it's master only of crime, cruelty, and sadism. you have lost the respect of the civilized world. So it was a very powerful statement. And I think that forcing the townspeople to confront what happened was the first step, really, in healing from the war. You can't heal from something until you admit the truth and confront the facts. So that was one of the definitive events that the 102nd experienced as they went through right at the end of the war. And there were other scenes as well where they went into other sites where killing had taken place. So Jim, your father and Father Glenn and everybody else in the 102nd, they must have been marked by this experience.
Yeah, they would have to be. I know I would have been. He wasn't. My dad wasn't often wasn't the kindest person. I don't know if that came from the war or not. Could have been he was a product of his times, but he was not always the most tolerant of people. But yeah, you're right.
I know that
Father Glenn. I'm sorry, Father Glenn was a great guy. Of course,
yeah,
he was a professional great guy as a priest, I think. But I remember when I was going through basic training and with the Coast Guard in Cape May, New Jersey in '71, the Vincentians have a retreat house there in Cape May. It's a resort area. It wasn't for me, but it was for them. And he came by one day, and I was able to. He was able to check me out of basic training, and I went off with him for the day.
Wow.
Very, very, very kind man.
It's great that you spent that time with him. And what about his involvement as well with you? Well, let's talk a little bit about the time after the war. So in the case of my father, he was already married and had a child. My older brother, who's 8 years older than I am, was already born. But he went in, and then came along me and my sister, the baby boomers. And in your father's case, he got married soon after the war, I guess. And you're one of the baby boomers too that came along at that point.
That's right. My mother and my father had all been as part of the same crowd before the war. And actually, she had married somebody else, Arthur Smith, but he had been killed early in the war. He was drafted also, but he died early in the war. And then she married my dad when he came home. They were married on January 1st, 1946. And my mother told me once that the guests, back then, the guests were all hungover. They hated my parents for doing this to them. Yeah. And then my older brother, Harry, was born later that year. I'm named after Father Glenn.
So that's why you're Jim. Okay.
And he married my parents, and because I'm named after him. And then he married my wife and I, and he baptized our first child, Allison, who went to Seton Hill, and she was his last baptism before he died.
Wow. That's an amazing story, and it's so wonderful to hear about that long connection you had with Father Glenn and your family. And boy, January 1st, 1946, about as soon as you could possibly get married, right?
Right. He was on terminal leave.
Yeah.
At that time.
I see. Okay, wonderful. Well, and then what about your father in the years afterwards? What kind of work did he do? And I know I saw somewhere that he retired to Florida at some point.
Well, Dad was a machinist because he was a motor guy, and he worked for many years for the Boston Gear Works. I still think he exists under a different name in Quincy, Massachusetts. But from childhood, he always had lung issues. I guess today they call it, for older people, COPD, but we just called it asthma and bronchitis. But he had this all of his life. And finally, that forced him to quit working. And my mother had to actually go to work. And giving her her due, she was working and also attending night school at Bridgewater State University, or Bridgewater State College back then in Massachusetts, and did get her degree at night.
Okay.
tolerating all of us during the day, kids. So I give her a lot of credit for that. But she was working for Harvard University on the condition that she would get a degree. So that's why she got her degree. And then went on actually, she wound up retiring, I think in '88 from Boston University. But Father Glenn was always a factor. Dad, like I said, Dad was a machinist, but Father Glenn being based primarily in and around New York, one time in Toronto, another time in Springfield, Massachusetts. But he would come by once in a while. I remember he would come by and spend a Thanksgiving with us.
Mm.
He would always be there. And I mean, I know we went to his anniversary as a priest once. So he was always there.
You know, these stories about what happened to people after the war, sometimes just as fascinating as the war experiences themselves. People were eager to get back to normal life, but it wasn't always that easy to do. It wasn't always the easiest thing. So, thank you for sharing that. And you know, it's great to hear these stories. And Jim, you and I could talk for a long time, probably sharing stories about this. But I think that we've given sort of a basic outline to the audience about what the collection is about. And
Jim, could I interrupt one? Just quick. John is asking a question. He wants to know about my dad's experiences with a life photographer, or maybe it's Dennis.
Okay.
At Gardeleg, and that story is, there's one well-known photo that was in Life magazine of the door that was closed over the bodies, and my dad was there. His job, I believe, one of his jobs was to escort these people around, and there was a life photographer taking the photograph, and my dad walked up and took the same shot with him next to him, had the same shot, and he asked the photographer what his camera settings were, and according to my dad, the photographer looked at him and said, "Hell, I don't know. I just take the picture. If it comes out, it comes out."
Yeah, that's great. That's a great story. And by the way, I'll just project real quickly. That Life magazine article is really a significant one. Let's see if I can share this.
That question was from John Spurlock. I'm sorry.
Yeah, so, right, it's, you know, I've studied the Holocaust very extensively, as you can imagine, and I didn't know about Gardeleg, and I had not heard about it. It doesn't always get a lot of coverage, but Life magazine in 1945 did have an edition where they had an article where they described what happened. They had photographs. They had interviews with the soldiers. And so it's really nice that they did this article and that we can still find that online like we can so many other things. So John, thank you for that question. John Spurlock is our historian who has worked on putting together the history of the death marches in Gardeleg. And I was just about to say, though, that why don't we open it up for questions from the audience? They may have things that they would like to ask. And so I see, and please write it in the chat if you have a question. So there's one from Joseph Martin, who writes, "Just wanted to say that my father was also in the 102nd Infantry Division, 406th Infantry Regiment." And is he, well, that's interesting. Do you know Joseph Martin, Jim?
No, I do not.
Joe, I wonder if you can enable your microphone so that you can talk to us.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
There you go. Yeah, Dad was in the 406th Infantry Regiment, and like Jim's dad, he really didn't talk about his experiences much unless he was prompted to do so, and it's like pulling teeth, actually. Kind of just brushed those questions off. But one of the things he did speak of more often than not was this incident here. it obviously affected him in that way.
Yeah. Yeah, I can imagine. It's, I mean, you couldn't forget something like this. What a profound experience. Joe, if I can ask, are you in the Greensburg area, or where do you
Yes,
live?
I live in Scottsdale.
Okay,
Oh.
okay, very interesting.
Yeah, Dad was actually from Pittsburgh at the time he went into the service, but my mother was from Scottsdale, and they moved here after the war.
Mhm. Well, my goodness, it's really good to meet you virtually anyway. Thank you for being on this program. It's a nice coincidence that they were both in the 102nd together. That's pretty amazing.
Glad to be here. My wife caught the article in the Trib this morning, and she says there might be something you might be interested, not even knowing my dad was in the 102nd, because I am a history, I hate to use the word buff, but I am a student of history.
Sure.
And she said it's about World War II. She says something called the Gardelegen massacre. And I just perked up and I said, oh, my dad was there.
Wow.
So I definitely made a point to tune in today.
Well, thank you so much. What a coincidence. That's amazing. It's great to have you with us. This is wonderful.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Now, we also have a question from Hannah Vinson. Hannah is one of our interns in arts administration who has really been working with this collection and serving as the curator of it. And she'll be presenting over the next couple of Fridays. So Hannah, it's good to have you with us today. And Hannah's asking, Jim, do you know how your father's passion with photography started? Was it the war that led him to begin to take photographs, or did it start sooner than that?
Good question. I really don't know. I just know that the evidence leads to the war. I don't know of anything he did beforehand. I have no photos from before the war, maybe very, very few, but the war is where he really took off. There was a lot to photograph.
Absolutely. You would want to grab a camera with what was going on there.
Yes, yeah.
And he was, he was really interested in documenting what he was seeing. He was writing a lot of letters back home to Myrtle and to others. And even if he wasn't talking specifically about what he saw in the war, you had the sense that he wanted to preserve what those experiences were like.
Sure, exactly.
Yep.
Yep.
Very good. And what about after the war? Was he I know my dad has, if I could find them somewhere, he was a movie buff. He was taking 8mm movies of the family all the time. What about your dad? Did he continue taking photographs?
He also had a movie camera and film that he purloined in Germany when he was there. His later in life, his go-to camera, it was a Contax Icon, is what it's called. Well-known camera for the time, just up there with the Leica.
Yeah, wow.
And, a 35mm camera, and it's right over here. I have it on my shelf. I've used it too as a teenager and later. He would take that on vacations along with a Rolleiflex, but that was his go-to later in life. Because a 35mm film was cheaper than the 127 used in the Rolleiflex.
Right.
But it took great photographs, and he was a very good photographer. He wasn't out all the time with it. I wouldn't say it was hobby. He was just very adept and enjoyed it.
Yeah, very good. All right, wonderful. All right, now William Menzel, I hope I'm saying it right, says, has an interesting question for you, Jim. What do you say to Holocaust deniers?
I was hoping he was asking you that.
Oh, okay. Well, I can answer it too.
But it's difficult. I don't run into many Holocaust deniers. I don't recall speaking to any, but it's very difficult. I know from my law enforcement background, you can't reason with a fool.
Mm-hmm.
And anybody who believes that is just a fool.
Yeah, yeah. Well, it is something that we have to address at the center because, you would think that it's settled historical fact. But, there are groups today who continue and individuals who continue to want to deny it. So, yeah, all you can do is present the facts. We screened a wonderful movie last semester based on a trial that Deborah Lipstadt, the Holocaust scholar, had in Britain around the year 2000, where she was sued by a Holocaust denier because she had said that basically he was an anti-Semite, and he sued her for that. So it actually went to trial in England, and there's a wonderful movie called Denial based on it, and it's one good example of how you address Holocaust denial. And but you're right. I mean, all we can do is share the facts, to teach the lessons, and hope that people are not misled by misinformation.
Well, Jim, when the camps were being first discovered, wasn't it Eisenhower, General Eisenhower, who told the press, go in, photograph everything, because sooner or later some son of a bitch is going to say this never happened.
Yeah.
And he was a prophet to say that.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. It's a great quote. And indeed, we have so many wonderful documents that verify what happened at the time. Holocaust scholarship is a large field, and it's still growing, and appropriately so. So it's a great question. Thank you for asking that, William. We have a question from Frank Harvey, my colleague here at Seton Hill, who asks approximately how many people perished in the atrocity. It was just over 1,000.
2016. I think 3 or 4 survived, didn't they? And I think they were French, or some of them were French.
Yeah, there were a handful of survivors who were able to tell the story of what had happened. But yes, over 1,000.
So I think
people.
the Germans went in after the fire was over and asked if anybody was hurt, that they need help, and those who moved or said anything were shot. And that's what the survivors reported.
Right. Okay. Mm-hmm. Indeed. Let me see. I'm not sure that I see other questions from the chat. Let's see. Looking here. Let's see. I'm sorry. This is well, okay. We have a few comments going back and forth, but any other questions that people would like to ask? It would be possible to unmute your mic and make a comment if you would like to do that. So perhaps anybody want to make a comment? Don't be shy.
Jim, where geographically in Germany is Gardeleg?
Good question. I don't know how to describe where it is. Jim, do you know?
I have a rough idea, but it's I don't know. Let's bring in John Spurlock on this one. John may be able to
it's in northern Germany. And if you attend the meeting on November 13th, we will have maps. So
good.
Excellent.
Good, John. Thank you. Thank you for
Sorry, I can't just describe it more clearly, but I need a map in front of me. So.
Yeah, well, northern Germany is helpful. What points us in the right direction, anyway. Okay, other questions?
Were the crimes adjudicated in the trials that followed the war?
At Nuremberg. I don't know. I don't think they were. Jim, do you know, or does John know?
They were not.
I don't think, no.
Very few criminal acts were adjudicated at Nuremberg, unfortunately. But
exactly.
In fact, I can tell you this, spoiler alert, but the the SS commandant for the area survived the war and actually lived until a pretty ripe old age. He was never put under any kind of criminal process.
Mhm.
And he, again, I would ask that you attend the meeting on the 13th when we can go into this in more depth. But this was somebody who really did have blood on his hands.
Yeah, absolutely, John. And I think this is something that people are very surprised about. You know, we have the sense that the Nuremberg trials really brought most of the Nazi leadership to justice, but in fact, there were very, very few who were given sentences through the Nuremberg trials. And of course, there were many who also escaped, like the Doctor of Death, Joseph Mengele, who unfortunately lived out a long life in South America, and he's certainly not the only one. So the justice was far from complete for the perpetrators, and that's part of the the sad legacy of that time, and part of the burden of the victims and the survivors. And by the way, we have a comment from one of my colleagues who says that Gardelegen is in Saxony. It's in the Saxony within Germany. So thank you for that, Judith. I appreciate that. And let's see. And then finally, Annie Urban has said, thank you, Mr. Knights, for sharing your father's stories and these important photos with us. And I concur with that. It's a very important collection, and it gives us all sorts of insights, both into the Holocaust and into the life of the American soldier. And it's a unique and very valuable collection. And we're very grateful, Jim, for your.
Well, and I'm grateful to Seton Hill and the center for taking care of these things. There's a theory that we don't live forever, but if someday I'm not around, I'm glad you have the collection that'll be taken care of.
Yeah, well, thank you. And I want to mention too that eventually the whole collection will be available virtually. We'll be putting it online, and so it will be hopefully available in perpetuity, that it will last.
Yeah, I was at the National Holocaust Museum in Washington quite a few years ago, and I looked for evidence, anything about Gardelegen, and I couldn't find it. Then I realized, of course, it was primarily Poles. There wasn't.
Yes, yes. Yeah, so it's an important part of the story to tell, absolutely. Well, Jim, again, thank you so much. And the audience, thank you all for joining us. It's wonderful to see some alums here and some current students, and also people from the community. It's been really nice to spend this past hour with all of you. So please come back next Friday. This was the only one that meets at 3 o'clock. The other 4 in programs in the series will be at 6 p.m. So I hope you'll be able to join us next week and in the subsequent weeks for the remainder of the programs. So thank you all. Have a good evening.